We're wrapping up the last of the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk actually follows the journey of the prophet through his earnest prayers and his complaints and his petition. It's him wrestling with God and God just being silent through it. Most prophets, when you read through the Old Testament and you read a book that's written by a prophet, most of the prophets, they speak to the people on behalf of God. They're God's mouthpiece. Habakkuk's a little different because Habakkuk actually speaks to God on behalf of the people. And so he relays God's answers back to the people in the later chapters of the book. And so in chapter 1, it's the very first part of chapter 1, we see that is Habakkuk praying all about what's going on in his culture, in his city, amongst his people. And as he prays, all he gets in return from God is just silence. And that's disturbing to him because he begins to wonder, does God really care? Or is he just indifferent? And there's a passage in Habakkuk 1, verse 2, where Habakkuk actually says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help?" It's like he's saying, God, I'm continuing to beat on your door. How long am I going to have to do this before you wake up and realize everything that's going on in my nation? You ever feel like that today in America? That as we look around and we see all of the craziness and the chaos that's taken place in our society, and you just wonder, how long is God going to be silent about all this before He wakes up and He pours His wrath out on us? Well, later in chapter 1, God finally answers Habakkuk. And God's answer to Habakkuk is, I am doing something, you just don't see what I'm doing because you're not looking for it. You're looking in the wrong spot. As a matter of fact, God says, I'm doing something today that you wouldn't even believe. That's so interesting because Habakkuk expected God to work in a particular way. God was either going to come in and create revival amongst the people, or He was going to remove the leadership, or He was going to depose the king and install a new king. Habakkuk was convinced that God was going to step in politically or within the leadership of the temple and fix all of the problems. But God says, that's not how I'm going to deal with this. And when God reveals His answer to Habakkuk, Habakkuk is disappointed because God's answer isn't not only what he expected, it's not the one that he wanted. You see, God said, I am going to raise up another nation. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, and they will come and they are going to completely destroy the nation of Judah. I'm going to use this violent city-state, Babylon, and I'm going to allow them to discipline you. My discipline is going to come through another nation. And Habakkuk, at the end of chapter 1, he protests God's plan. And you remember, he verbalizes and he says, God, how can you allow a people who are violent and evil to overcome a more righteous people? And God then returns one more time in chapter 2. This is what we saw last week. And God reassures Habakkuk, don't make any mistake here. Babylon's not going to be allowed to present their evil forever. I will deal with them. They're not going to be allowed to exist indefinitely. They will receive punishment for every wrong thing they do. In the meantime, this is what God said to Habakkuk. In the meantime, you stay faithful to me. Don't worry about all that's going on or how I'm solving the problem. Stay faithful to me. And so as we finish this story, we're going to see Habakkuk finally come to rest in the ways of God. And he's able to trust God no matter what the circumstances may transpire. So look at Habakkuk chapter 3, starting with verse 1. Now, if you have, I read out of the New Living Translation. Now, if you have an NIV or a King James or an ESV, this very first sentence, it says a lot. A lot of times we skip over this particular sentence, but it really communicates a lot about what's going on here. Now, my translation said this prayer was sung by the prophet Habakkuk. Now, in most translations, it actually says that Habakkuk is praising God according to Shigionoth. That's the word, that's the Hebrew word there. So basically, when we read that, we don't understand what that means. But whenever I put it in this context, you will. You ever taken a music class in high school, and your music teacher instructed the choir to sing in an appropriate manner? Maybe she said, we need to sing this with a lot of rhythm, or we need to sing this particular part of the song really, really loud. Now, I don't know what all those technical terms are. I wish Miss Richmiller was here. I could ask her, but there are some technical terms for all of those, how you're supposed to sing at particular junctions. This right here, Shigionoth, is instructions how, well, it's actually recounting how Habakkuk prayed here. Shigionoth is a form of singing, a form of praise that's not a soft, gentle prayer. This is an exuberant, a loud, a passionate praise. So this is full of enthusiasm. It's how he goes about this next chapter. So this is the key. You gotta understand this is not him just quietly saying these things or praying these things or recounting these things. Habakkuk is celebrating. He's rejoicing. He is screaming at the top of his lungs and dancing all the while he's saying these things. So this is key. What you see when you read that and you sense the way that Habakkuk is approaching this next prayer section, you see his attitude has changed. He's not meek anymore. He's not dejected. He's not beat down. He's not despondent. He's actually enthusiastic about what he has to say. Look at verse 1. This prayer was sung by the prophet Habakkuk. I have heard all about you, Lord. I'm filled with awe by your amazing works. In this time of our deep need, help us again as you did in years gone by. And in your anger, remember your mercy. So Habakkuk, what we see here, he's went from this whiny, complaining prophet that, oh God, I need an answer. Now he's exulting in the goodness of God. He's been enlightened or even changed. So this is a picture of his spiritual maturation. He reverses his approach to God. He doesn't come and just make demands of God. He's not whining. He's not complaining. He's praising God for His work and asking Him, look, he says, in this time of our deep need, help us again as you did in years gone by. He's asking God, continue the work. God's told him, I'm going to use Babylon and we're going to discipline Judah through Babylon. And now Habakkuk is actually saying, continue with that work. He's come to this point where he recognizes that there's nothing that he can do to force God's hand. And when God begins to move, there's nothing that he can do to stop God. He's saying here in verses 1 and 2, I've heard all about the work that you've done. I've heard the stories. I've read the scriptures. Habakkuk admits, he knows Judah is a mess. He knows that Judah needs to be punished. And he sees and he recognizes that God's wrath against sin has to be executed. Divine justice is needed to correct the situation. And so Habakkuk is saying, I don't understand your work, but continue to do it. But, look at the very end. In your anger, remember your mercy. He's saying, I recognize that we're a mess, that you have to deal with our sin, and that your wrath is going to be poured out and justice is going to be done. But while you're doing it, God, please have mercy on me and my people. You see, Habakkuk knows in his mind, if God vents his full anger out on Judah, there's not going to be anything left of Judah. God's going to slay them all. He says, I don't think you're doing anything, but now that you are moving in judgment, please be merciful to us as your people. Because He knows that without God's mercy, it's the end. It's all over for the nation of Judah. How often do we, you and I, how often do we think that God's not doing anything in our situations? How often do you believe that God's silent, that He's not at work? What do you think it would be like if we was able to see that strategic planning center in heaven, where God would kind of pull back the curtain and show us how He's at work and what He's doing? If we were able to look behind the scenes, don't you think that we too would cry out for mercy? I mean, if we could see down the road 10 years, all of the angst, all of the chaos, all of the pain that we go through today, and we cry out and we say, God, why are you being silent? You know, shaking our fist and maybe even becoming a little angry at God because we're His people. God said that He'd answer our prayers, but He's not. And if God said, okay, come here, and He pulls back the curtain and He says, this is what I'm at work doing, I think we would fall on our knees and beg Him to have mercy on us. I think we would beg for mercy for the future of our nation. I think we'd beg for mercy for the future of our economy, our families, our churches. We would absolutely melt into a puddle crying out for mercy if we knew what He was really up to. Now, in the next sentences that we'll read here, in these next verses, Habakkuk is going to begin to recount how God has, quote unquote, saved us. That's what he said there in verse 2. Habakkuk is going to begin to weave this collage of historical events together and paint a picture to try to trigger the collective memory of his fellow Jews about how God has always been faithful to His people. He's going to remind them one thing here. The first thing, hope is going to be given by remembering how God has delivered us. Look at verse 3. I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. His brilliant splendor fills the heavens, and the earth is filled with His praise. His coming is as bright as the sunrise. Rays of light flash from His hands where His awesome power is hidden. Pestilence marches before Him, plague follows close behind. And when He stops, the earth shakes. And when He looks, the nations tremble. He shatters the everlasting mountains and levels the eternal hills. He is the Eternal One. And I see the people of Cushan in distress, and the nation of Midian trembling in terror. Was it in anger, Lord, that you struck the rivers and parted the seas? Were you displeased with them? No, you were sending your chariots of salvation. Of course, I think we all know, if you're a student of the Bible, you can see that he is referring to that defining moment in the history of the Jewish people, the Exodus, when God miraculously rescued and led His people out of slavery in Egypt. So that's where Habakkuk begins this rhetoric, this prayer. He is describing God's work as He rescued His people out of Egypt. Look at, he says, I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, and the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. Both of these locations are located south of Palestine. They're south of Judah, down in the desert. This is where the Israelites roamed for 40 years, where God protected and provided and prepared His people for the promised land. So Habakkuk's writing, and he's trying to trigger the memory of his fellow Jews, saying, don't you remember how God led our people out of Egypt, and they wandered for 40 years down in the desert? And when he says things like pestilence and plague, that's like something out of a movie, isn't it? Where God is marching, and before Him is pestilence, and following Him is plague. God, the creator warrior, is mowing down anyone or anything that stands in His way. And he talks about the people of Cushan or Midian. These are the people that lived in that desert area, that when God brought His chosen people across the Red Sea, these are the people that opposed the Jews in the desert area and how God crushed them. These people were distressed during that time as they watched this swarm of Jews come out of Egypt and just marched north, and nothing could oppose them. Nothing could stand in their way. It was as if Yahweh was leading His people north. So they're actually watching a real God in action while they're worshiping little wooden idols. And they're in awe. And that's what Habakkuk is doing. He's pointing his people back and saying, remember that time. Remember how God led us out of Egypt. In verse 8, he said, you struck the waters and parted the sea. That's more imagery from the Exodus, where God parted the Red Sea and led His people across. Or whenever they crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land, and how God stopped the Jordan River. This is just God eliminating those geographical barriers so that His people could finally find rest. So this section right here, this is just a poetic memory of God, of how God saved Israel from Egypt. Look at the next section, verse 9. You brandished your bows and your quiver of arrows. You split open the earth with flowing rivers. The mountains watched and trembled. Onward swept the raging waters. The mighty deep cried out, lifting its hands to the Lord. The sun and the moon stood still in the sky as your brilliant arrows flew and your glittering spear flashed. You marched across the land in anger, and you trampled the nations in your fury. You went out to rescue your chosen people, to save your anointed ones. You crushed the heads of the wicked and stripped their bones from head to toe. With His own weapons you destroyed the chief of those who rushed out like a whirlwind, thinking Israel would be easy prey. And you trampled the sea with your horses, and the mighty waters piled high. Now, Habakkuk's not referring to any specific historical event here. He's simply illustrating how nothing on this planet, no elements of the earth can withstand the Lord when He is set out to rescue Israel. Verse 11, it says this, the sun and moon stood in the sky. Even the cosmos, the sun and the moon, they stand at attention to do the Lord's bidding. Some people would look at this and immediately refer back to that story in the book of Joshua, chapter 10, where God made the sun stand still in the sky while Israel conquered their foes. It could be referring to that. Verse 12 through 15, this is just the Lord trampling the nations as they opposed His people. So Habakkuk is just saying, let's look back at history. Let's see all the things and all the ways that God has always met our needs. I want you to think about that for yourself for just a second. I want you to recount in your mind all of the times that God has stepped in and rescued you. When God has provided a way when there was no way. When you were praying and it seemed like He was silent and it came time that something had to happen, God shows up in grandeur. And it's the same way Habakkuk can see. He can look back at Israel's history and he can see how God has personally intervened every time to save His chosen people. If you are a follower of Christ and you're in a personal crisis right now, God will rescue. It may not be how you want it to be. It might not look like you expect it to look. But God's great plan will come to fruition. And that's what Habakkuk is reminding his people of. God has always been there. The second way that Habakkuk provides hope here is he's reminding the people that hope is given when we trust God. Look at verse 16. Habakkuk says, I trembled inside when I heard this. My lips quivered with fear. My legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. I will wait quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. Habakkuk has finally gotten the message about how Babylon is going to come and triumph over Judah. He's made peace with it, if you will. He's kind of coming to terms with it. But he's fearful because he knows that God is going to make good on that promise to discipline Judah through Babylon. But he can also remember how God deals with anybody who arrogantly opposes him. In verse 16, I'm going to sum that up. Verse 16, Babylon is going to receive their due. They're going to get what's coming to them. It's almost as if Habakkuk is saying, God, you've done it before, and I know you're going to do it again. And he says, I will wait quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. He has taken that promise that God gave to him back in chapter 2, where God said, don't worry, don't fret, don't be misconstrued, don't get it misconstrued. I will deal with Babylon. Their evil will not be allowed to exist indefinitely. I'll take care of that. And here, Habakkuk is saying, I'll just sit over here in my corner and I'll wait patiently for God to take care of that problem. Now, look at this. In verse 17, we see Habakkuk is going to reveal a very difficult lesson that he's learned. Habakkuk says, even though the fig trees have no blossoms, and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength, and He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. You see, Habakkuk learns, this is the lesson that he's learned, and that is that his worship shouldn't be contingent upon his circumstances. When life is good, it's easy to worship the Lord. But when life is a mess, or life is chaotic, or there's hard troubles, that's when we often find it most difficult to worship the Lord. But through this whole process, Habakkuk has developed a steadfast faith in the Lord, knowing that God's going to preserve His people. And so he says, although the fig trees have no blossom, there's no fruit on the vine, the olive trees are barren, the flock is cut off, there's no herd. He's saying, when everything is stripped away from us, when there's not even a morsel of food on the table, I will still worship you. You know, you can't get any more desperate than that. When everything is taken away, Habakkuk said, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. How would you respond to the Lord if everything that you had was stripped away? If you could imagine that for just a second. If your health was taken away, kind of like Job, the book of Job. Health is taken away, your family's taken away, your wealth is taken away. All you have are a bunch of scabs and the shirt on your back. Would you rejoice and praise in the Lord? But that's what Habakkuk is doing here. He's vowing to stay in this rejoicing, mindful part of worship in spite of all the calamity that he faces. You see, Habakkuk right here, by the way, as he writes this, Babylon hasn't invaded yet. Habakkuk is actually praising the Lord before the Lord ever gives the provision. That's key for all of us. That's something we all have to remember. Pray right now. Be in a mindful, joyful state before He ever answers your prayer. Despite the circumstances, Habakkuk knows that life is good and God is worthy of praise. And so that's what he does. He knows that God is the source of joy, God is the source of hope, and he is saying, I find satisfaction not in my stuff, not in my security, not in when things are well. I find satisfaction in the Lord. But what about us? You and I. I sat down and I could think up dozens of reasons why we should not rejoice. I could think of a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen reasons why I can sit around and grumble and complain and be upset. And I'm sure you could too. Think about times when our health takes a downturn. Or maybe it's when you lose your job. Or broken relationships. Maybe rebellious children. Maybe you lose a loved one. Maybe grief sets in. Maybe you're like Job. Maybe you lose 2 or 3 people in a short period of time. Or maybe it's nothing that's happening to you directly, but maybe it's the state of our world. The isolation that comes from a pandemic, having to change our lives around, the way that education has changed. Well, the craziness of the world itself is enough to cause us to be depressed. But will you still find joy in the Lord in the midst of these difficult situations? Will you trust that God is still at work for your good? Will you do that? Will you ignore your personal perspective on how things are going and trust God's promises? Will you do that? See, if I took Habakkuk out of this story and I put you or I in here, would our story look like Habakkuk's? Or would we get to about the end of chapter 1 and just stop? Because God wasn't acting the way that we think He needs to act. Or He's not providing that rescue like we expected Him to. Will you still be like Paul in Philippians, where he said, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And again, I say rejoice. You see, amazing things can happen when we stop looking around at all of the junk that's going on and begin to put our eyes on the Lord. When we can find ourselves in a state of worship of God, perspectives change and people change. And that's what we have to keep in the back of our mind all the time. That has to be our attitude as Christians. Through the whole story, Habakkuk actually comes to a point where he learns to embrace the things that are going on. So if you zoomed in with a microscope on what's going on in Habakkuk's life, you might be able to sympathize with him. But if you stood back and took a macro look of where he started and where he ended, what you would see is the prophet is on this journey of spiritual maturity. When we first come in contact in chapter 1, we see that he is almost like an immature believer. Immature believers are people who are new in the faith, but it can also be people who have been Christians forever and they've just never grown in their faith. But immature believers, they're content to just possess a simplistic, superficial faith, thinking that God is there to meet their every whim. But Habakkuk's experience, it led him to a more mature understanding of who God is. And it's not that he knows, here at the end, it's not that he knows all about God, but it's that he doesn't know, yet he still trusts God. You see the difference? Habakkuk here at the end, he's not writing that, oh, now I understand all of the things of God and the ways of heaven. But he's matured in his faith to where he's at this point now and he can say, yeah, I don't know all there is. I don't understand why God does what He does, but I do know this. I'm going to trust Him. You see, this has been the story of how Habakkuk has progressively began to understand that God is faithful. In chapter 1, he began with, why, God? And then he stayed patient, and he prayed, and then God moved him to this point where he's at now, where it's, I don't understand, but I still trust. Interesting fact. Names actually hold meaning, right? your name really, it has a underlying meaning. It might, like Jason is like something like mighty warrior. Habakkuk, that his name really means to embrace. And I think in a real tangible way, this book has been about how Habakkuk has learned to embrace the gap between offering up a prayer and God answering, and all of the junk that goes in. I drew a little graph here. Show that last. I think there's a gap between those times that we ask God for things and when God actually responds. There's a time gap. And in that time gap, a lot of stuff goes on. I called it the junk. The things that would make us turn around and go back. Habakkuk, this story, this whole book, I think it's just a great story about how Habakkuk learned to embrace the junk. He began to learn, he learned that God is marching out against Judah. He's doing this not in the way that I would expect him to, but he's doing it for our own sake. You know what? If we believe, I'm talking to believers, Christians, if Christians believe that God only defeats our enemies, you're not going to like having Jesus for a Messiah. Because God sometimes has to defeat things in us. And sometimes it's necessary that we have to walk through the desert, that we have to trudge through that gap. But spiritual maturity is when we arrive at the place where we can trust Him in those times, in the gap. We don't like the junk that happens in the gap, but we're mature enough now to know that it's necessary. God has to take us through this, and I don't like it, and I don't necessarily understand it, but I'm going to trust Him. So it's us embracing a joyful attitude when there's nothing to be joyful about. But we're content because we know that the Lord is still faithful and can still be trusted. We embrace the good and the bad because we know it's all for our own good. And in the end, He'll receive much glory. That is what it means to have a full faith, when you can embrace the junk. Let's pray. Lord, there are times that I admit that I'm in the gap, and I'm wallowing in the mud and feeling sorry for myself, and I'm complaining and griping, wondering when you're going to show up, wondering why you remain silent. But Lord, it's your book, it's your word, it's the writings of people like Habakkuk that renews my faith in you. And it clues me in on what a full faith truly looks like. That if I want to embrace Jesus as my Messiah, that I've got to embrace the way that He plans to deal with me. And if I'm going through the junk, it's passing through His hand. And Lord, we just as a collective people, we'll cry out right now and say, we don't necessarily understand what you're doing right now, God. And it's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. But Lord, we're going to trust you that in the end, it's all for our own sake. And we will give much praise, glory, and honor to Him who hung upon the cross, giving victory right out of the jaws of death. Jesus Christ, amen. Thank you. Have a good week. You're dismissed.